I will be discussing the subject of general consensus or ijma, which is a recognized proof of Sharia and a basis of lawmaking and judgment in Islam. It is an important proof of the Sharia and stands in order of authority next to the Quran in authentic Sunnah of the Prophet. The only non-revealed source of Sharia that is known to Islamic jurisprudence that constitute a definitive evidence. I'll be discussing the meaning and definition of ijma, its essential requirement, and some of the conditions of ijma, and whether its feasibility and the basis on which ijma stands, then the varieties of ijma, and finally some of the reform proposals, how to make ijma relevant to contemporary processes of legislation and adjudication. It is an important source for different reasons, simply because the only source of Sharia that is representative of the will and consensus of the Ummah. There are two sources of authority in Islam. One is the divine revelation or wahy on the one side, and on the side of the will of the people, it is the only decisive evidence that is known to Islam, and therefore establishing this balance, the authority of wahy on the one side and ijma on the other, both are qat'i, definitive evidences. I will be discussing the definition and meaning in some detail. First, the meaning of ijma, it has two meanings. One is to make a decision over something. And the second meaning, which is of concern to us here, is to reach an agreement upon something. In many ways, the two meanings are related to one another, because if you reach an agreement, there has to be a decision over which you can agree. But of course, a decision can be without a general agreement. And it is interesting that ijma does not occur either in the Quran or Sunnah in its technical sense that we are concerned with today. It does occur in the Quran in the sense of making a decision, and also in the Sunnah. There are examples that in the Sunnah also occurs in this sense. But we do not have ijma used in either of these sources as a source of the Sharia in a decisive evidence. This is something that leads us to the conclusion that there is no textual proof, decisive proof for ijma. It is important as the ijma there are some controversial aspects, I will mention them, but to specify the value in the role that ijma plays, in addition to being the expressive of the will of the Ummah, Muslim community, it tells us the veracity of which version of the tafsir of the Quran do we accept or we do not accept. Which version or transmission of the hadith can we accept, and which do we doubt. Ijma eliminates doubt. Ijma establishes the authority of other proofs, and Ijma expresses the will of the ulama and mujtahidun of the ummah. It is self-evident that this is a vital source. It is a very important proof of the Sharia, notwithstanding the many controversies that we will now touch on so many aspects of Ijma. If we just now refer to the definition of Ijma, we will notice the difficulties that we have with Ijma. Technically, Ijma is defined as a unanimous agreement of the mujtahidun of the Muslim community, the Ummah, after the demise of the Prophet Muhammad in any period on any matter. This is the technical definition of Ijma. Some definitions will replace the last two words, not on any matter, but on Shari'i matters or on religious matters. But otherwise, this is the definition: unanimous agreement of the mujtahidun of the entire ummah. And you may ask the question, has it ever happened? And is it possible? Unanimous agreement, if there is one exception to Ijma, Ijma collapses. Why? Because the expectations are so high. It is a decisive proof. If there is agreement, Ijma cannot accept agreement within its ranks. If the mujtahidun of Shia disagree with the ruling of the mujtahidun of Sunni segment of the community, or any other group or faction, Ijma collapses. Now we notice the difficulties. First, in addition to the difficulty I've just mentioned, where are these mujtahidun? How do you identify them? Where do they live? And even another, how do you define a mujtahid? There are some mujtahid who we cannot really put our finger. They are mujtahidun. If I ask this question, and you define Ijma as a unanimous agreement of the mujtahidun of the ummah. When we mention the mujtahidun are those who are fully knowledgeable of Sharia, of the sources of the Quran and Sunnah and the custom of society, know Arabic, and they have the caliber of judgment to ascertain strength and weakness in the opinion of others, to resist pressure of, again, at times, a tumultuous time, and to stand on the side where they speak with authority. Naturally, when we mention Ijma is the consensus of the mujtahidun, the laymen and those who have no knowledge of Sharia are excluded. And this itself becomes a little controversial. I will refer to that. Then after the demise of the Prophet, Ijma, in other words, is not valid during the time or the lifetime of the Prophet. Why? Simply because he was the authority. If there was any doubt, if there was any question, he could be asked and he could deliver authoritative decision in judgment, and therefore there was no need. Although in reality, as I will say, that the, the companions, even during the lifetime of the Prophet, they were in other places. They were not always present in Medina, and they have exercised to some extent the idea of consensus. On any matter, the consensus, unanimous consensus, is proof, definitive proof, stand on its own authority on any matter. And that is also quite a controversial term to say. In reality, it is actually not true that ijma can proceed over any matter. For example, over hissi matters, over factual matters, ijma is of little value. If I ask, for example, what is the population of the world or of Malaysia, and you say there is a consensus over this, it doesn't make sense. It's a question of numbers. Also on intellectual matters, aqli matters, there is no need actually for ijma. If I say that justice is good and lying is bad, do you need ijma for that? It's something that we can rationally understand. Similarly, on linguistic matters. Linguistic matters, what is the meaning of this word or that word? It's the question that is, you look at the dictionaries and lexicons, and there is no need for ijma on that. Similarly, on urfi matters, customs of society, almost like facts. It's a different matter. The difference between custom is the consensus of the society, laymen and ulama and officials, everyone together. And on that we actually don't need ijma. On aqeedi matters, on matters of beliefs, if you say that there is only one God and that the Prophet is the true messenger of God, and there is a consensus for that, it doesn't sound right. It's a matter of belief and faith. A consensus does not proceed on any matter, in all matters. In reality, is over shari'i matters, matters which are open to ijtihad, in interpretation, ijtihadi matters. This is the proper constituency of ijma. But the definition keeps these words, notwithstanding the fact that the ulama knows all these doubts. This is because of the isma of the decision of the ummah. The infallibility, it's almost a doctrinal kind of acceptance that the will of the community, the unanimous agreement of the ummah carries its own isma. It's almost infallible. Whatever they decide, whether lughawi or shari'i or hissi or aqli, if they make a consensus over it, that's that. This is almost a kind of a doctrinal position that the ulama have inserted in the definition of ijma, despite the controversies that we have just mentioned. The value of ijma is also evident from the fact that the fiqh that we know is a huge legacy. The fiqh is a cumulative effect of ijtihad and ijma. Ijtihad is doubtful. We cannot accept it at face value. It only becomes authoritative with the general consensus. And when there is the support of ijma behind ijtihad, it is raised from the level of opinion to the level of the hukum of sharia. Otherwise, we will be in the realm of doubt. And that is not how any community, can lead and regulate its life. You have to have a structure of authority. And ijma is just that. It is said that Ijma came to a halt following the 3 or 4 centuries of Islam. It is somehow tied to the idea of ijtihad. They say that the doors of ijtihad were closed after a certain period, 3 or 4 centuries, and therefore Ijma also came to a close. This is a false parallel. In all likelihood, in every generation, many scholars, Izzuddin Abdus Salam, Ali al-Shawkani, they tell us that there has been mujtahidun in every period of history. They have reached consensus, and ijma has been a reality. Ijma also another role that it plays. It plays two almost contradictory role. One, that it is an instrument of conservatism. It retains the authority of the decisions of the past ulama and imams. And when they reach consensus and that authority established, and it reaches us and we respect it because this has happened. This is an instrument of preservation and conservatism. On the other hand, ijma is also an instrument of reform, an instrument of change, the only valid instrument that can express the vision and consensus of the community at any given time, any period. That is, if the ulama and mujtahidun of our time decide that this is the law, or this law should change in a way that is expressive of the cultural and educational refinements of this generation, then that is the role that ijma plays. Then there are the requirements of ijma that we need to specify. What conditions or requirement must it fulfill in order to become authoritative? Several have been mentioned. Maybe three are essential requirements. One of them is, of course, that there must be a plurality of mujtahidun to make a consensus possible. But no one has actually specified what is plurality. Is 3 a plurality, 2 a plurality, or do we mean a very, very large number? This is not specified. If there is a place or time in which the ulama, the number is very small, maybe 3 or 2 are also qualified. But that is one requirement. A single opinion does not bring about ijma. Then, of course, there must be unanimity. Unanimity at any given time, at any given period, and that consensus agreement must be by unanimous, without any opposition or disagreement. Although there is an opinion, some ulama, including the Quran commentators Al-Tabari, Al-Razi, Fakhruddin Al-Razi, Ibn Jarir Al-Tabari, and later Shah Waliullah Dehlawi in 18th century, they have said in reality ijma is a consensus of the majority of mujtahidun, and to say that in accordance with this classical definition that it is a unanimous consensus, and it has been in fact throughout history, it's an exaggeration. It has not been the case. And then the third condition is that the agreement of the mujtahidun is demonstrated in an affirmative sense. That is either in a written, they have written it in a book or in a fatwa or in a judgment, or they have expressed it in some way, but it has to be demonstrated in a positive sense. We cannot presume agreement and consensus by presumption. It must be proven in an affirmative sense. These are basically the essential requirements of ijma. There are some conditions, and that is pertaining to the constituents of ijma, the mujtahid. The mujtahidun must be upright and qualify as adl, upright, and it has its own definition, but we cannot. I have explained this in my book, in the chapter on ijma, this book, Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence, 2003. There is a chapter on ijma, and some of the detail that I cannot include in this 1 hour can be consulted there. There are that is the one, that the mujtahid must be upright, that the mujtahid is not a carrier of bid'ah, is not propagating something which is a pernicious innovation and departs from the consensus of the community. And of course, the mujtahid must be knowledgeable of Sharia. There are some other conditions that are not supported by all, and these are saying that first, that the mujtahidun are confined only to the first period, the Sahaba, the companions. When we mention the Ummah, consensus of the Ummah, who was the Ummah at the time when the Quran was revealed? The answer is that these were the companions. So that is the ijma of the companions, which was meant. The Shia says that the ijma, the consensus is the consensus of the Ahl al-Bayt, the household of the Prophet, his descendants. And they identify these descendants. They are recognized imams. But having said that, in Shi'i doctrine, ijma actually is attached to the Sunnah. It does not have its independent existence. When you say that it is a consensus of the recognized imams, and this immediately their consensus is also the Sunnah. The definition of Sunnah, according to the Shi'i doctrine, is different. Not only the precedent and decisions of the Prophet himself, but also the authoritative imams. And when you say this, ijma, their ijma, in the meantime becomes Sunnah. And therefore, that is different to the Sunni doctrine. The Malikis say that ijma is confined to the ijma Ahl al-Madina, the consensus of the people of Medina, because these were the recipients of the teachings of the Prophet, and their consensus is the most authoritative. And the next condition is that the consensus we are talking about should not be in disagreement with the consensus of the Salaf, the recognized imams and ulama of the past. And there is one rather a strange condition, and this is the discontinuation of the generation in Qira'at al-Asr, that all the mujtahids who participated must have died, and only then their ijma becomes authoritative, must have passed away. Why? Because for so long as they live, they can change their opinion, but only after they cannot do that. But The answer to that has been given, like Al-Ghazali has said, that it's not possible to actually identify this idea of disappearance of the generation. People die and some are born and some live. Now, where do you draw the line? This inqirad al-asr is, is not really possible. When ijma fulfills all of these requirements, the conditions, then it becomes authoritative and it becomes wajib. From then on, even the mujtahids don't have the flexibility to depart from this. Because it is a definitive, decisive proof, we are bound by it. Ijtihad, you can differ, you can change, you can talk about, but ijma, no. And ijma also is not open to the idea of abrogation. Strangely enough, that the Sunnah in the Quran are open to abrogation if you agree with abrogation, but not the ijma. So, next discussion is the proof of ijma. The proof of ijma we mean in the text, textual proof of ijma. Is there any clear text in the Quran or Sunnah to tell us that ijma is a proof of the Sharia? The simple answer to that is no, that there is no clear text in the sources to that effect. And yet the ulama, the scholars, have quoted a large number of ayat, and a large number, even a larger number of ahadith in support of ijma. And I have quoted about 8 ayat on this page 237, and about maybe 10 or 12 hadiths on the following pages, all given in support of ijma. The first ayah is this ayah in Surah Al-Nisa, ayah 59, very well known. Obey Allah and obey the Messenger and those who are in charge of the affairs among you. Ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. This ulil amr is understood to be a reference to the consensus of the ulil amr, because it is in plural. Ulil amri minkum, from among you. In other words, if there are some mujtahidun or scholars in another community, in another country, they do not represent us. They must be from ourselves, Muslims. Now, that is one. And the ulama, there are 2 types of ulul amr. In temporal affairs, these are the government leaders. In juridical shari'i affairs, these are the ulama. The 2 types of ulul amr. They make their decisions in different respects in their own areas of concern. But the Quran does not specify what ulil amri minkum, full stop. It doesn't say in shari'i matters or in any other different temporal matters. Therefore, we retain the general meaning of ulul amr in this ayah. The constituents of ijma, therefore, in our time, as I would say later, must include not just the ulama of Sharia, but ulama in other affairs of importance to the community, in economics, in medicine, in computer science, in other areas. I will read in my discussion on reform proposals, we'll touch on this point. And there are ayat. If I go through them, it would take a lot of time. But others also have quoted hadith like La tajtami'u ummati ala dwalala. My ummah shall not reach a consensus on something that is in the nature of misguidance. That is to say, this is evidence for the isma, infallibility of the consensus of the ummah. They cannot reach an agreement on something that is untrue or misguided. Therefore, their decision carries as infallible. Not that they cannot commit an error. Yes, they can, but that their agreement on something, consensus, cannot be of that kind. That is authoritative. And that مَا رَآهُ الْمُسْلِمُونَ حَسَنًا فَهُوَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ حَسَنًا. What the Muslims consider to be good, it is good in the sight of Allah. It's a hadith quoted. In the Quran and Sunnah, when in the Quran we read praises for the Ummah, Kuntum khairu ummatin ukhrijat linnas, you are the best Ummah raised for mankind. Ta'muruna bil ma'ruf wa you command good, you prevent evil, and you have faith in God. And the Quran qualifies itself. You are the best Ummah if you have these requirements. If you are on the side of good, if you prevent evil, and if you have faith, then you are good. And your consensus, therefore, is authoritative. Many ayat that is carried through the sense of that. But there are also, every one of these ayat is subjected to critique, and none has fallen. Al-Ghazali says that all of them are in the nature of probability. These are zawahir, these are manifest evidences. None amount to a nas, a clear text. It says that the Prophet himself has not actually said or mentioned ijma, that this is, or given it explicit kind of blessing. Therefore, لا تجتمع أمتي على الضلالة. First, لا تجتمع can mean two things. One is, it can be prohibition. Umma la tajtami ummati ala dalala. Don't you agree on something? That can be a prohibition. But another, la tajtami ummati, negation, that my ummah does not agree. So you see, there are two different meanings. And here we find that the text is not free of an element of doubt. Then again, ummati, what is meant by the ummah? As I said, the Hanbalis and others say this is the companions only. The Shia says this is Ahl al-Bayt. The Maliki says this is only the people of Medina. The Shafi says it's all the ummah. And the Hanafi says it's only the mujtahidun of the ummah. The mazahib give different interpretation to ummah. And dalala, what does dalala mean? Does it include kufr? Does it not include kufr? And therefore, Muhammad Abdu, the famous Quran commentator, he says that neither the Quranic ayat nor the hadith speak of ijma. What they do speak is of fraternity in unity, solidarity in the ranks of the ummah. And to quote them in support of ijma as the sense of the definition we have given is an exaggerated claim. And there is one hadith, لا تزال طائفة من أمتي على الحق ظاهرين. A group of my ummah will always remain on the side of truth. And this hadith clearly doesn't talk of all the ummah, it's a group of the ummah. And this is quoted by Shah Waliullah. Shah Waliullah Dehlavi says that The ijma we are talking about is basically a relative concept, ijma of some scholars, the majority scholars, and this is a group among them. Ahmad Hassan, who wrote a book on ijma, he says whatever way you look at it, the evidence in the Quran and Sunnah, it's inconclusive. In the early period, during the time of the Prophet, we don't know of the word ijma mentioned in this sense. There is not consensus on the meaning of the ummah. Therefore, we should just read the general meaning in this hadith, but stop there. That is the argument about the textual proof of ijma, but is there rational proof for ijma also? Yes, there is. Ijma is basically, at the root of ijma is ijtihad. Ijtihad is regulated by a certain methodology, and it has a foundation in the text. And when all the mujtahidun and ulama throw their support and consensus behind the ruling of ijtihad, then this rationally tells us that the truth is on their side. It's the rational argument for ijma. I've discussed the textual evidence in support of ijma, but I want to finish just with quoting Al-Ghazali's opinion. And he says that notwithstanding the fact that there is no clear text in the Quran or a mutawatir conclusive hadith, but that the collective weight of all of this, when you put it together, is undeniable. That is something that he says, well, there are many things that we accept on that basis. People agreed on the courage of Ali, on the generosity of Hatim, on the erudition of Shafi, on knowledge, although there is no mutawatir report on these things. That is something that the collective weight of the evidence we have quoted, even though if you individually discuss them, they are subject to doubt, but that is something that is undeniable and therefore comes close to mutawatir, to decisive and positive proof. Now I will move on to another subject, which is the feasibility of ijma. Is it interesting? I mean, ijma is this inherent strength of ijma is basically undeniable. You cannot turn away from it. With a ton of argument, I think the consensus, the will of the community and the enlightened representatives of the community, this is something we have to depend on. But okay, the feasibility of ijma, the Shia, the Kharijites, in a group of the Mu'tazila, they do not actually accept ijma as a decisive proof. They say it's no more than the opinion of some mujtahidun. And they are expressive of doubt. We don't know about the number of the ulama that have concluded this or that ijma, whether this is unanimous, and that all must be simultaneous. And the Zahiris and the Hanbalis say that what we mean by ijma really is the ijma of the companions, full stop. And we have already said the other mazahib tend to, it's due to their awareness of the difficulties of unanimous consensus. Some say this is only the people of Medina, others say it's only the household of the Prophet, others would say specify. These are expressive of element of doubt on the universality and unanimous consensus requirement. But the Jumhur, the majority of ulama across the mazahib and schools of thought, they say all of these arguments actually something that argues about something that has happened. It is a reality and it does happen. You cannot turn away from something that is actually happened. Like they give examples in the area of inheritance, for example, the son's sons is precluded from inheritance in the presence of the son. Also that the entitlement of the grandmother in inheritance is 1/6, and there is an ijma on that, although there is reported to be a hadith on it, but basically the hadith is weak. It cannot establish a decisive ruling without ijma. Ijma supported it, and therefore it became universally accepted. That share of the half brothers is equivalent to that of full brothers in inheritance. This is also established by ijma. There is in history, we have not had any kind of a council or a parliament for ijma, except in the times of the Andalus. In Umayyads' time, there used to be a ulama council. Sometimes there are references to it. But beyond that, we have not really organized, institutionalized ijma, and therefore it is open to doubt whether the feasibility of ijma. Abdul Wahab Khalaf, a professor of Azhar of 20th century, he says that ijma, according to his classical definition, is not really feasible. What is feasible is that majority consensus on a relative basis, and he says that in our time, how can we make this a feasible procedure, a feasible proposition? He says that first we must depart from the idea of the individual mujtahidun being the consensus constituents of ijma. It must now be the idea of the individual, not mujtahidun, but the assembly of representatives of the ummah. That both ijtihad and ijma should become the prerogative of the representative assembly of a parliament, for example. That must include not only the ulama but other scholars of the community. That the government now should play a role. Without the government influence, it will be difficult to ascertain consensus in our times. Often what it has meant is that we have not known any disagreement on this ruling, but to say that positively we can establish, prove unanimous consensus as a factual matter, it's very difficult and not quite feasible. Others have given, modern scholars, Al-Khudari and Zakiuddin Shaban, they have written books on Usul al-Fiqh. They say the period of the companion. Khalaf also says that even during the time of the companions, many of them were in faraway places in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen. They were not all there together, neither them nor the mujtahidun and scholars among them. And that did not stop Umar and Abu Bakr, the two caliphs, to actually gather the leading among the companions and consult and reach decisions. It was a majority representative kind of proposition. Otherwise, if you say that all of them were present, like Muaz bin Jabal was in the Yemen, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was somewhere in Iraq. They were the leading mujtahidun. They were not in Medina. That is the reality of that it has not been a unanimous consensus of every single mujtahid, even in that time. But Al-Khudari in Shaban says that during the companions' time, we can divide them into two periods. The Shaykhain, the first two caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar, during their time, the number of leading mujtahids among companions was limited, and it was possible for them to reach consensus. And they said that, but afterwards, during the period of Sayyidina Usman and Sayyidina Ali, then there were differences, and also it became the sheer size of the Muslim dominion expanded to the extent that it became physically difficult, and also there were political, even military confrontations. The idea of the practice of ijma became rather difficult after that. Now, I have another discussion on the types of ijma, the varieties of ijma. There are some varieties. One is ijma sarih, explicit ijma. Explicit ijma is where the constituents of ijma are known and they have expressed their consensus in an affirmative sense, and that is the most authoritative ijma. The next is ijma sukuti, ijma by silence, rather a disputed kind of ijma, and yet many have supported it, although some Shafi'is and some Hanafis and some Malikis, they say that you cannot have consensus through silence. A person who remains silent, he cannot be presumed to have agreed or disagreed. Now, others say, the Hanafis and many others, they said it is customary. You cannot deny that not every mujtahid will come and speak out. Some in every locality, the leading voice says something, and others, if they do not disagree with it, they may not actually explicitly pronounce their view, but that is a practical matter. So long as certain factors that interfere with this kind of recognition, if there is political pressure, if there is fear, if there are other factors that would invalidate our presumption of this silence being indicative of agreement and approval, then it is customary, and we agree with it, with some reservations. The Hanafis say, even if you bring all the mujtahidun of the Ummah in one place and they all shout, we agree that some among them may not have actually said it. And how do you know? Of course, those were the times when we didn't know these electoral processes and balloting and these procedures that we now know. And in any case, there is opposition to the idea that we should actually institutionalize ijma in that order. I will come to that. Despite the fact that the Hanafis and some others have agreed with it, they have introduced some reservations. One is that these fear and favor elements should be absent. That everyone has been given the time and opportunity to and communicated this to them, and that the matter is an ijtihadi matter, not a matter which is determined by the clear text, and that also they say that it should be at a time before the crystallization of the mazahib, which is rather odd. Once the mazahib were established, then I think the process became clear, and the ijma also, new ijma became somewhat a matter of some doubt. But they say that in addition to these conditions, they draw a distinction between what they call azima and rukhsa. Azima is affirmative decision of a general kind that established commands and prohibitions. the original sense. Ijma sukuti or ijma by silence is not valid in establishing original commands or prohibitions. But in subsidiary matters, in matters of establishing subsidiary details in the nature of rukhsa, concessionary rules and so on, ijma by silence is acceptable. Al-Ghazali mentioned and add that we can only accept this if there are also additional indications that no one actually is in disagreement. And despite all of these conditions, that we can ascertain that it's reasonable to conclude that silence is indication of agreement. And that the silence, if we know the silence is because of this or that, is the other, it should be the kind of silence that we cannot really interpret in any other way but agreement. The types of ijma I'm discussing. Then there is ijma qawli and ijma fi'li. Verbal ijma and actual ijma. Consensus on expressed in words and that which is expressed through action. It is the first which is the more important and more authoritative. But there are also aspects of consensus, like when we buried the dead, we bury it in a certain way, and face the qibla and this and that. It's a matter of action. When we would perform the wudu and so on, some of the details, a matter of actual ijma. Then ijma is divided into two types. One is directly derived ijma, ijma muhassal, that the constituents of ijma are present and directly participate. This is direct ijma. Then the second variety, the larger variety, ijma manqul, transmitted ijma. Transmitted ijma is that it has reached us through the reports of the reporters. And this is, the reports are often in the nature of solitary reports, not mutawatir. If it is below mutawatir, then it is zanni, it is not decisive. There are some details about all of this, but I would mention a little bit about this ijma of the people of Medina, which is the Maliki doctrine. There are 3 hadiths has been given in support of this. One is al-Madinatu tayyibatun. Medina is pure and get rid of its impurities. Islam sticks to Medina. My companions are like the stars. Whoever of them lead, you follow, they will lead you to the right path. Some of the examples of Ijma al-Madina is that when the Imam gives the sermon, he addresses the audience, not the Qibla. He does not face the Qibla. And his back is to the Qibla, so to speak. This is by consensus, actual consensus. Like the Iqama, when we read before the congregation prayer, we read the Iqama. It's different to Azan. We don't repeat twice every part. And this tasniya, duplication, is abandoned in Iqama, contrary to Azan. This is practical ijma. Then there is no zakat on vegetables, for example, no zakat on vegetable produce. This is the companions, have some practices and people of Medina. These are some of the examples. There is another discussion. I cannot give much detail on the Sharia evidence of ijma. There is always some kind of basis on which the ijma stands, without there being some support for it in the higher proofs, the Quran and Hadith. All what you can expect will be disagreement and ikhtilaf. What kind of sanad or proof for ijma you can have? Of course, the text. What role does ijma has with regard to the text? It gives us the authoritative interpretation of the text and also the sunnah. Can qiyas in maslaha, analogical reasoning, and public interest be the basis, the sanad of ijma? Generally, the answer is qiyas itself, analogy itself, is speculative evidence. How can it be the basis of decisive evidence? But in reality, it has been accepted, and there are examples of qiyas being the root of ijma. Maslaha, yes, is the basis, can be the basis of ijma. For example, the Jam' al-Quran, collection of the Quran into one volume. This is for the maslaha. A second azan for Friday prayer were introduced during the time of Omar, because Medina became big. And a testimony of close relatives, not accepted. Although at earlier times it was accepted. It's for the maslaha, it then became consensus. The transmission of ijma, as I've said, and I'm running out of time, is either through mutawatir or through ahad. Most of the ijma that we have is through solitary hadith, and therefore that does not establish conclusive, decisive evidence. Reform proposal, an important part. There are difficulties. There are controversies about ijma, and there are some reform proposals. The first earlier one was from Shah Waliullah Dehlavi. He says ijma must be accepted as a relative concept, not universal consensus, in which case we can have consensus of different communities and ulama in different places and localities, the ulama of Saudi, of Pakistan, of this country. That will be accepted if we accept ijma as a relative concept. And he has some support, and he cites some hadith in support of that. Muhammad Iqbal has important reform proposal that we must, in our time, it is such an important, a vital doctrine. It has never been institutionalized, and we cannot really afford to marginalize ijma. So we must give this authority of ijma and ijtihad to the representative elected assembly. But that assembly must include the ulama of Sharia and scholars from all other important fields. Muhammad Yusuf, another Pakistani scholar, he disputed Iqbal's view, because he said that if you make ijma a matter of political parties in this government and that government, you have politicized ijma, the natural element through confidence of people expressed in some scholars, that is lost. Then Ahmad Hassan, who wrote a book on it, he says that Muhammad Yusuf did not quite understand Iqbal. We don't have much choice but to make ijma in ijtihad a collective idea and place it and give it a sense of reality. Al-Sanhuri and Al-Turabi, they have said that the basis of a representative government in our time, we don't have much an alternative. It must be consensus. What is more authoritative than saying that the will in consensus of the Ummah is a manifestation of the will of God? This is a vital doctrine for Islam. Mahmoud Shaltut says that So long as you guarantee freedom of opinion to the constituents, whether it's parliament or that, we would have preserved what is most important in ijma. And there is another opinion by Badran who says that in matters that are practical ijtihadi, like election of the leaders, like putting limits on ownership, like declaration of war and peace, this must be through consensus, and that consensus must be identifiable. I conclude by saying that to be expressive of suspicion in the collective will of the community, the way that Muhammad Yusuf is not quite, it's in a way that God places his trust in this ummah, but we cannot trust the ummah. This is not quite the way that we should understand ijma. Thank you.